Now, the Russo-Polish alliance had always been difficult because the Polish government in exile, based in London, was obviously a government of the Polish exploiting classes, and it was a pretty fascistic government to boot. It was forced, this fascistic Polish government, it was forced to oppose the Germans, but only because the Germans were engaged in a cynical takeover of their country for the purpose of providing Germans with Lebensraum. But otherwise, you know, they thought pretty much alike, apart from that small detail. The Soviet Union's position was that so long as the Soviet Union could retain the land east of the Curzon line, they had no problem with the re-establishment of a bourgeois government in Poland. But the alliance was already in difficulties because the Polish government in exile, headed by General Sikorsky, based in London, would not agree that land would be returned to the Soviet Union after the war. And this is in spite of the fact that in 1941, after Hitler invaded Poland, the Soviet Union and the Polish government in exile had not only established diplomatic relations, but had also agreed that the Soviet Union would finance, under the orders of a chief appointed by the Polish government in exile, but approved by the Soviet government, the formation of a Polish army. This chief being, in the event, the thoroughly anti-Soviet General Anders, a prisoner of the Soviets from 1939. By the 25th of October of 1941, this Polish army had 41,000 men, including 2,630 officers. But General Anders actually refused to fight on the Soviet-German front because of this border dispute between Soviet Union and Poland. So what could you do with this Polish army? Well, they were sent to Iran to fight there. But nevertheless, despite the hostility of the Polish government in exile, there was a significant section of Poles resident in the Soviet Union who were not anti-Soviet and did accept the Soviet claim to the territories east of the Curzon line, and many of these were Jewish. These people formed the Union of Polish Patriots, which put together the backbone of an alternative Polish government in exile. The Nazi propaganda relating to the Katyn massacres was designed to make it impossible for the Soviets to have any dealings with the Poles at all. General Sikorsky took up this propaganda with a vengeance, and he came to Churchill claiming that he had a wealth of evidence to prove that this massacre had been perpetrated by the Soviets. You could ask yourself, well, how did he obtain this evidence simultaneously with the German announcement of this supposed Soviet atrocity? And you know, if he's got evidence other than the Germans' statement, it suggests there must have been some secret collaboration through which this evidence was obtained. Anyway, the Germans made their allegations public on the 13th of April, and on the 16th of April, 1943, the Soviet government issued an official communiqué denying, quotes, the slanderous fabrications about the alleged mass shootings by Soviet organs in the Smolensk area in the spring of 1940. And it added, the German statement leaves no doubt about the tragic fate of the former Polish prisoners of war, who in 1941 were engaged in building jobs in areas west of Smolensk, and together with many Soviet people fell into the hands of the German hangmen after the withdrawal of Soviet troops. Now, in fabricating their story, the Germans embellished it with an anti-Semitic twist. They claimed to be able to name the Soviet officials in charge of the massacres, and guess what? All these names were Jewish. And on the 19th of April, Pravda responded, feeling the indignation of the whole of progressive humanity over the massacre of peaceful citizens, and particularly the Jews, the Germans are now trying to arouse the anger of gullible people against the Jews. For this reason, they've invented a whole collection of Jewish commissars who they say took part in the murder of the 10,000 Polish officers. For such experienced fakers, it wasn't difficult to invent a few names of people who never existed: Lev Rybak, Avram Brodninsky, Chaim Feinberg. No such persons ever existed, either in Smolensk section of the OGPU, or in any other department of the NLVD. So the insistence of Sikorsky in endorsing the German propaganda led to the complete breakdown in relations between the London Polish government in exile and the Soviet government. And Goebbels commented on this in his diary. He said, "This break represents a 100% victory for German propaganda, and especially for me personally. We have been able to convert the Katyn incident into a highly political question." Now, at the time, the British press condemned Sikorsky for his intransigence, and the Times, on the 28th of April 1943, wrote, "Surprise as well as regret will be felt by those who have had so much cause to understand the perfidy and ingenuity of the Goebbels propaganda machine, should themselves have fallen into the trap laid by it. Poles will hardly have forgotten a volume widely circulated in the first winter of the war, which described with every detail of circumstantial evidence, including that of photography, alleged Polish atrocities against the peaceful German inhabitants of Poland." Anyway, what lay at the basis of Sikorsky's insistence that the massacre had been carried out by the Soviets rather than the Germans was actually the dispute over the territory east of the Curzon line. Sikorsky was trying to use the German propaganda to mobilize Western imperialism behind Poland's claim to that territory, to try and force them out of the position, as he saw it, of taking the Soviet Union's side on the issue of this particular border dispute. But if you read bourgeois sources today, they all assert that the Soviet Union was responsible for the Katyn massacre. And they do it with such assurance, such consistency, that when you try and argue the contrary, you feel like a Nazi revisionist trying to deny the Holocaust. You know, after the Soviet Union collapsed, Gorbachev was enrolled on this disinformation campaign and produced material allegedly from the Soviet archives, which proved that the Soviets committed the atrocity, and of course that they did so on Stalin's orders. Well, we know that the interest that the Gorbachevs of this world have in demonizing Stalin, their target is not so much Stalin as socialism. Their purpose in denigrating socialism is to restore capitalism and bring lives of luxurious parasitism to themselves and their hangers-on at the cost of the mass suffering among the Soviet peoples. Their cynicism matches that of the German Nazis, and it's hardly surprising to find them singing from the same hymn sheet. Now, bourgeois sources blithely claim that Soviet evidence in support of blaming the Germans for the atrocity was either totally absent or based purely on hearsay evidence of terrorized inhabitants of the region. But they don't mention one piece of evidence which even Goebbels had to admit was a bit of a bummer from his point of view. And he wrote in his diary on the 8th of May, 1943, "Unfortunately, German ammunition has been found in the graves at Katyn. It's essential that this incident remains a top secret. If it were to come to the knowledge of the enemy, the whole Katyn affair would have to be dropped."